Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I'll briefly talk about how to teach a novel. Now, this question was sent to me by a friend from Pakistan, and she mentioned that anytime she teaches long novels, she has a problem focusing her students and her classes on the novel and how best to approach teaching a novel. Now, this video doesn't really address how to teach a novel for graduate classes and graduate students. I'll mostly be dealing with teaching a novel in an undergraduate class or in a high school class. Now, let's say you decide to teach Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. It's a 400-page novel, right? So, how to set it up if you were creating a unit or if you were creating a syllabus, the first thing I would highly recommend is start with an introduction to the author. Have a video or a PowerPoint in which you introduce the author, her work, and her times. So that places the author in a given time period and her setting. And then you decide and tell your students where the novel is set. Is it the contemporary time of the author, or has she set it up before her times? That will ground the novel for you in author's own life and where in her life, in her repertoire, does the novel appear. Then an important thing to distinctly make clear to your students is about the period of the novel itself. Is it a realistic novel? Is it a modernist novel? Is it a postmodernist novel? Is it a naturalist novel? And then, is it a feminist novel? By declaring that, let's say if it's a modernist novel, then you will have to teach them something about modernism. If it is a realistic novel, you'll have to teach them something about realism. If you want to go more conceptual, let's say if it's a post-colonial novel, then you'll have to figure it out. Is it a realistic post-colonial novel, modernist, postmodernist? But what that enables you to do is create a body of knowledge, learning skills for students to understand that you can't just read a novel. You have to know something about the author and their times. And you also have to know the period, the writing style, because a modernist novel, you will read it differently than you will read a realistic novel. How? In most realistic novels, which employ realism, characters are what they appear to be. Because realism, even though it uses imagination, represents the world as it is, as the author sees it. In modernist novels, the narration is more experimental. The characters can be inconclusive sometimes. We don't really know if we trust them or not. But if your students know these things, then they will learn to clearly deal with the novel according to its time period, according to the movement within which it falls, modernism, postmodernism. Then some teachers come to class with 3 or 4 themes. This novel is about love, it's a coming of age story, and it's a story of a young woman making her way in the world. It's good to have those themes, but the only thing to keep in mind is don't constrain your students in those themes. If sometimes they come up with thoughts and ideas that go beyond that, there should be room for that. But the themes would enable you to focus the discussion. Now, to tackle a novel over a semester or over, 15 or 16 class periods, even if the novel doesn't have parts, part 1, part 2, part 3, divide it into parts. You can divide it, if it's a character-driven novel, from one phase of the character's life. Where does it end? Where the new phase starts? Start second part there. third part after that. And that way, the chapters that are part one will have a certain aspect, a certain spectrum of the character's life and experiences, and you can discuss them in part one. But it also tells your students what are they supposed to read before your classes, right? Part one is first 55 pages, and all the themes and everything covered in that is what they are supposed to know. Now, if you've watched on my movie on what are the constituting part of a short story, the same are the constituent parts of a novel. A novel always has characters. A novel always has a setting, both temporal and spatial. It will have tone, a certain kind of way of saying things. It will have a point of view. It will have a narrator, omniscient, non omniscient, first person, third person. It will have a theme, love, hate, war. So you can also divide your discussion of the novel around its constitutive parts. Now, one thing that worked for me when I was teaching at a university was every part that we discussed in class, I will assign a group to one aspect of the novel. There'll be one group who will be responsible for character, main character, and a few other characters. There'll be one group who will be responsible for setting, one group, for point of view and narration. And what they will do is they will discuss in groups any given part that we are studying in that week, and they will put that on the blackboard. And then we'll have a discussion about it. Now, another thing to keep in mind is since most novels that you'll be teaching, there'll be something written about them. So pick one or two accessible articles about your chosen novel. Make your students read them either in groups or individually, because what that gives you is someone else's opinion about the novel. How have they expressed it? And then that gives your students another point of entry. What does Said say about Conrad and why does he say that? Right? That gives you a chance to refocus discussion on one or two critical readings of the novel and then discuss it in opposition to that or from that point of view. It worked great for me, let's say, when I taught Heart of Darkness. When I taught Heart of Darkness, I always teach it juxtaposed with Things Fall Apart, but I also ask my students to read Chinua Achebe's famous speech and essay about Heart of Darkness. Now, what that did was it gave them an account by an African author, his response to the novel. That was a post colonial response, and that enabled my students to look at the novel not just from a Eurocentric point of view, but from an African perspective. And they either argued against Achebe or challenged his assumptions or agreed with him, but that gave us one more thing to talk about the now. Now, bear in mind that you have to make sure that they're reading. There are several ways of making sure that they're reading. Some people use quizzes. First day of the week, there is a quiz on the reading. I never use the quizzes because quizzes they are kind of punitive because at the end of the day, they get a grade and it's like, oh, I made 60. So you could find other ways of asking them to be accountable for their reading. You could give just brief questions aimed at knowing whether or not they've read the novel. You could also give them quests. Okay, here are 5 sentences. Find them. Where do they appear on which page number? What's the context of these sentences? You could do it as a group. You could do it as a competition, right? Where you post the question on the board and then each group seeks it, looks for it, helps each other find it. And that's another way of holding them accountable about the reading itself. But to make sure that they are reading, you could also do in-class journals where you give them a prompt that requires them to write a journal response, open book journal response, but they will not be able to answer it if they haven't read it. These are some of the ways in which you can make your students accountable and make sure that they are reading. Overall, a novel, by its very nature, is an expansive narrative. So breaking it into parts for reading and then discussing it with it constituting parts. Characters. Who's the main character? What does the main character do? How is the main character represented? Is there a protagonist and an antagonist? What's the conflict? What's the tension between the two? You could focus on the language itself and see what foreign words have been used, have been anglicized, and what purpose do they serve. You could look at the setting and go into an historical research about where is the novel set, which place, what was it when the novel was being written, what is it now, and time. What time period does the novel represent? What kind of things were happening then? What kind of culture did exist in that setting during that time? So never be afraid of giving a week or 2 weeks to one constituting part of a novel, to the characters, to the setting, to the tone, to the theme, to the point of view, narration, structure. How is the novel structured? The idea is that it's an elephant, right? You have to eat it one piece at a time. Lining up those pieces thematically will enable you to encourage your students to read the full novel, but focus on character, focus on the setting. There are also different kind of worksheets that you can find online. I'll see if I can post a link to a few that I use. One of them that I'm using these days is where they fill a worksheet for setting. They fill a worksheet for characters. They name the character, they attribute certain things to them, and then explain them and give a reference to where it is mentioned. You can look up these worksheets, but what those do is they encourage them to fill those worksheets as an assignment, but it forces them to go find those things in the novel. And what you can do is have a sequence. Read part one, first 5 chapters. We'll do a character worksheet. We'll do a setting worksheet. We will do a worksheet on language. And they save those. You grade them. And then they can use them in their journals. They can use them in their midterm. They can use them in their final paper on the novel. So all activities and practices are geared towards a greater understanding of the novel, but also helping them finish longer assignments. So overall, I know it's not a very convincing video, but let me revise again. Start with author biography that introduces the students to the author and their times. Start with where the novel is set, when was it published, a brief history of the novel. Then maybe talk about whether it's a modern novel and realist novel or postmodern novel and what are the implications of that. Discuss that. And then as they read, part by part, always handle a novel in parts. If it already has parts, Things Fall Apart has 3 parts. Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. Heart of Darkness has 3 parts. Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. White Sargasso Sea has 3 parts. Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. Part 3 is really brief. So you divide it into those parts if the parts already exist. If the novel doesn't give you the parts, then you create the parts based on the trajectory of the plot, if it is a plot-driven novel, or the trajectory of the main character if it is a character-driven novel. That makes it manageable for your students to read and for you to thoroughly discuss in class and prepare assignments. And then, as I mentioned, create in class assignments where they fill worksheets, where you give them a task and about a character, about the setting, or any other aspect of the novel. You can also do group work and hold competitions where they find the quote in the book, give you the page number, you can have prizes for that. And do include one or two good accessible articles so that they read them and find out what others have said about the novel, and then they engage with that and take that knowledge and start looking at the novel, from that perspective. So overall, these are some of my rough thoughts about how to teach a novel. Do keep in mind that for anyone teaching a novel, especially to undergraduates and high school, it's a challenge. And it's a challenge not just because you have to plan extensive lesson plans and then work with the students. It's also a challenge because we are living in times where people, young students, are not reading a lot. And especially they feel intimidated by long novels and long narratives. So part of your struggle will be in encouraging them to read. That's why it's also really important to choose novels, not because they're classical and high literature, but maybe also something that is also engaging and interesting. So I hope this is useful to you. As I said, this is not an exhaustive account of how to teach a novel. This is just mostly based in my experience. But let me know what you think, and if you have any suggestions, ideas that have worked for you, please post them in the comments so that I can benefit from them and anyone else who reads the comments can benefit from them too. Thank you so much. Stay safe, take care of each other, and as always, many thanks from me to you, and peace and love.